Hello again. I'm back and ready to talk about presidential selection some more. This afternoon, we're going to talk about reforms to the presidential selection process that occurred after 1970. So, without further ado, let's share the screen with my computer and go there. So, as the screen says, we're talking about presidential selection part two. And this is about reforms that have occurred to the modern presidential selection process. Two major reforms mark changes in modern selection processes. These are changes in party nomination procedures and two, federal regulation of money in elections. Both sets of reforms were a response to a particular set of conditions. Television and the greater visibility of nomination processes and the growing importance of the media were important to changes in the nomination procedures. The bad vibes, the bad images associated with elites selecting the party nominees as opposed to the people selecting the party nominees resulted in the first set of changes. Reaction to the failed Johnson presidency and anti-Vietnam protests and demand for more democratic accountability occurred. The assassination of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King in 1968. Both events occurred in proximity and before the Democratic nomination convention. And of course, there were also riots, race riots associated with the assassination of Martin Luther King. Reaction to the very tumultuous 1968 Democratic National Convention, where the bosses determined the outcome, produced calls for reform. Reaction to a growing sense of the importance of money in politics was important in sparking these reforms. And then also, and finally, a response to political corruption and Watergate were associated with all of this. Okay, so what were the reforms? The party reforms were sparked and altered by the McGovern Commission. After the 1968 Democratic Party convention, the party appointed a commission to examine the rules for delegate selection. One of those commissions was the McGovern Commission. I've got it hot linked there to the commission that was chaired by George McGovern. As a result of all of these initiatives, the following party rules changes occurred. In those states holding primaries, delegates had to be chosen in the calendar year of the convention. 3/4 of the delegates had to be elected in districts no larger than those for members of Congress, and the allocation of delegates to candidates had to fairly reflect the popular vote that the candidates received within the state. In other words, there was no winner take all in delegate selection. In those states where primaries were not used, that is, they used either caucuses or party conventions, delegates had to be selected in multi-stage caucuses that were well publicized in advance to allow adequate time for campaigning. And proxy voting was abolished in non-primary states. What is proxy voting? Proxy voting occurred when delegates to the convention were representing a substantial number of people, and this increased their voting power at the caucuses. In all states, the Democratic Party promoted more equal representation of the rank and file in the delegations themselves. It did that by implementing affirmative action plans for specific groups. Starting in 1980, half the Democratic Party delegates had to be women. So as far back as 1980, the Democratic Party implemented changes that were favorable to women. One consequence of these reforms was that primaries became the preferred method of delegate selection. To avoid having delegates challenged at the conventions, many state legislatures simply had the voters choose those delegates. This meant that the Republican Party had to follow the lead of Democrats. It was impossible for state legislatures to choose one mode of delegate selection for Democrats and another for Republicans. So the states actually determined the rules for delegate selection for both Democrats and Republicans. Since 1972, the party nominating processes have become more open and participatory and less elite oriented. In other words, it's become a more decentralized and people-oriented process. The changes in party nominating procedures has also meant a more candidate-centered rather than a party-centered process. In other words, in earlier times, the party leaders selected the candidates, and in modern times, what happens is that the candidate is the important entity there. Candidates go to a state, they campaign in the state, and they either win or don't win primaries, and selection is not by party bosses, but is determined by the candidates themselves. This has in turn meant less candidate loyalty to the political party subsequent to the election. It has also meant that nominees can count on less support after the election from those loyal to the parties. The increased reliance on primaries has meant less brokering in a convention, and that the nomination is usually sewed up long before the party convention. Other effects. Demographic representation to the conventions has become more reflective of the population, especially within the Democratic Party. However, ideologically, those who have attended conventions as delegates for both parties have tended to be more ideologically extreme and issue-oriented than the general population is. Democrats have tended to be more liberal, the delegates to the convention, and Republicans have tended to be more conservative than their respective populations generally. Those of you who have watched the Democrat and Republican conventions will probably notice a pretty significant difference between the view that you get at watching the delegates at both conventions. At the Democratic conventions, you get a view of the delegates as being women and men, black and white, brown and every other color under the sun, gay and straight, and so forth at the Democratic conventions. Whereas on the other hand, at Republican conventions, you have tended to see a much more white and conservative group at those conventions when you watch them on television. Further reforms by the Democrats after 1980, only a few states were given permission to have primaries before March of the election year. And this was an effort to shorten the contest. A sort of window strategy was adopted by the Democrats, who compressed and front-loaded the schedule. States moved their contests to the beginning of the period in order to maximize their influence on the results. The current nominating process of U.S. presidential elections consists of two major parts: a series of presidential primary elections and caucuses held in each state, and the presidential nominating conventions held by each party. This process was never included in the United States Constitution, and thus has evolved over time by the political parties to clear the field of candidates. The primary elections are run by state and local governments. Again, the primary elections are run by state and local governments, while the caucuses are organized directly by the political parties. Again, the caucuses are organized directly by the political parties. Some states only hold primary elections. Some only hold caucuses, and others use a combination of both primaries and caucuses. These primaries and caucuses are staggered between January and June before the federal election, with Iowa and New Hampshire by tradition holding the first presidential state caucus and primary respectively. Like the general election, presidential caucuses or primaries are indirect elections. The major political parties officially vote for their presidential candidate at the respective nominating conventions, which are usually held in the summer before the federal election. Depending on each state's law and state's political party rules, when voters cast ballots for a candidate in a presidential caucus or primary, they may be voting to award delegates who are bound to vote for a candidate at the presidential nominating conventions, or they may be simply expressing an opinion that the state party is not bound to follow in selecting delegates to their respective national conventions. Along with delegates chosen during primaries and caucuses, state delegations to both the Democratic and Republican conventions also include unpledged delegates who can vote for whoever they want. For Republicans, these include top party officials. Democrats have a more expansive group of unpledged delegates called superdelegates, who are party leaders and elected officials. Here's a link to a Congressional Research Service report that describes the presidential nomination process for 2016 in some detail. And we won't go to that link. It's fairly lengthy, and I'll let you look at that on your own. Okay, but I do want to look at this, which is a breakdown of how the nominating process has changed by state across time. And notice that we're starting we're starting in 1968. In 1968, sorry about that. In 1968, 30 states used a caucus or a convention to nominate their candidates, or to nominate their delegates to the convention. And the delegates chosen by local caucus and state convention, 4 were Republican. When delegates are chosen by a party committee, you had 1 state following that plan. You had party committee being used in 4 Democratic states. And in a closed primary situation, that is a primary where only members of the political party can vote, you had 10 states that used closed primaries. Independent primaries, you had 3 states that used independent primaries. These are states where party members and independents can vote in the primary. And you also had open primaries. In an open primary, any voter can vote in the primary election. And then you also had no states that used a non-binding primary. So segue forward from 1968 to 2008, which is where my data ends on this. Notice you moved from 30 states using a caucus or a convention down to 13 states using a caucus or a convention. That's a very large reduction. Delegates chosen by local caucus or state convention, you had 2 Republican states that did this, and you had 2 Democrat states that did this. Delegates chosen by party committee, you had 0. So you can see the selection process for both Democrats and Republicans has become more less elite oriented. 9 states in 2008 had a closed primary, that is, only party members can vote. 2 of those were Republican, and 3 of those were Democrat, and of course the remainder would have been both. Independent primaries, where party members and independents can vote, you had 7 states that used the independent primary. 3 of those were Republican, and 5 were Democratic. Open primary, you had 12 states that used an open primary. Notice the change there from 1968. You only had 4 using an open primary in 1968, and you went from 4 to 12 in 2008. This is a primary where any voter can vote. 4 of those were Republican, and 1 was Democrat only, and the remainder would have been both. You also had non-binding primaries again in 0 states. And so this gives you a sort of a breakdown of how things changed between 1968 and 2008. Here's a link that gives the presidential primary, caucus, and state convention dates for the 2020 presidential election. We will go there to see how front-loaded the election calendar is in 2020. And so you can see here that the Iowa caucuses this year occurred on February the 3rd. The New Hampshire primary occurred on February the 11th. And then on February 22nd, you had the Nevada Democratic caucuses and the Nevada Republican Alternative presidential preference poll. And then on February 29th, you have the South Carolina Democratic primary. And then finally, on March 3rd, you had all of this. You had Alabama, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. So you can see that with big states like California and Texas, among all of these other states, you can see that this is a very front-loaded process. It continues, and you can see that there's a lot less going on in other dates. But the bottom line here is that with this type of primary and caucus calendar, the nomination is already going to be sewed up well in advance of the convention. Again, I invite you to visit that page and look it over and see what's happening with the 2020 presidential election. See especially March 3rd, which is Super Tuesday. Other key dates, the 2020 National Democratic Convention will be held during the week of August 17th of 2020 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The 2020 Republican National Convention will be held starting on August 24th in 2020 in Charlotte, North Carolina. There's no official rule dictating order, but since 1936, the incumbent party has held its convention second. And so the advantage goes to the incumbent as to the dates for holding the national convention. Regulation of money is the second major reform that has occurred through time. So a second major reform after 1972 was the role of money in federal presidential elections. The role of money in a democracy has been a topic of debate for centuries. As we noted earlier, the founders were suspicious of direct democracy because they thought that people without property could be bought. Money is a potential basis also for diluting people's votes in a democracy and buying influence. In other words, the chair of Microsoft, by virtue of having a whole lot of money, is more important than you or me in buying influence in the election. Out of this concern came the notion of taxpayer-financed elections. The first time a public funding provision was introduced in Congress was in December of 1904 by Representative William Burke Cochran of New York. He believed that, and I'm quoting, "it might be possible for the government of the United States to do away with any excuse for soliciting large subscriptions of money by financing elections with public funds." Then in 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt advocated, and I'm quoting, "an appropriation for the proper and legitimate expenses of each of the great national parties." Similar sentiments were expressed in legislative proposals introduced during much of the first half of the 20th century. However, despite its enduring appeal, with some lawmakers, a public funding law was not passed until 1966, and much of that statute was subsequently repealed. But the momentum that it generated led to the eventual passage of the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971, the FECA, and the Revenue Act of 1971. The FECA regulated money in elections, and the Revenue Act of 1971 provided public financing of presidential campaigns. Then, in 1974, as a reaction to the events of Watergate, Congress enacted the 1974 amendments to the FECA, which established public financing of presidential primaries, nominating conventions, and the presidential election itself by amending the Presidential Election Campaign Fund Act and by enacting the Presidential Primary Matching Account Act. So it looks like we're in 1974 about to get public funding of elections. The reforms had four purposes. They were to limit skyrocketing campaign expenditures. Second, to limit the influence of large contributors on political behavior. Third, to make contributions more open. In other words, to let people know who has contributed to what political campaign. And finally, to subsidize through public expenditures national campaigns for the presidency. The FECA created an agency called the Federal Election Commission to implement the law and to assure that contributors and candidates complied with the law. That agency still regulates the use of money in federal elections. We can go to their website where you can find lots of information on how all this works. I'm going to briefly touch that link so that you can kind of see what's there. And you can see that we have a regulatory commission. We have data on campaign finance. We have help there for candidates and committees who want to comply with the law. We have legal resources there. And then we also have a presidential candidate map such that we can search for money raised, money spent, cash on hand, and so forth. So this gives you a sense, hopefully, of what is at the Federal Election Commission. They collect all of the data and they enforce all of the regulations on federal campaign finance. Following the 1974 amendments to the FECA of 1971, there was a court decision. Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976, challenged as an infringement on First Amendment rights of free speech, that law. The Supreme Court upheld Congress's right to regulate contributions and expenditures of campaign organizations, but the Supreme Court struck down the independent spending of individuals during campaigns. As a result, if money is channeled through groups or parties, it is subject to the law. If money is spent by individuals independently of the campaign, then it has until recently remained unregulated. So again, just to repeat, if the money being donated to campaigns is channeled through groups or parties, it's subject to the law. If the money is spent by individuals independently of the campaign, then it has until recently remained unregulated. So in response to the court's decision in Buckley versus Vallejo, Congress passed the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1976. That law did the following. It provided for public disclosure of all contributions and expenditures over a certain amount. At the FEC website, you can find out who gave what to whom and how much they gave using a search engine. The law also placed limits on individual and group contributions to candidates. Originally in 1976, individuals could give $1,000 to each candidate, $20,000 to the national party, and $5,000 to a political action committee. In turn, political action committees could give $5,000 to a candidate, $15,000 to the national party, and $50,000 each to other political action committees. Party committees could give $1,000 to candidates, unlimited amounts to the national party, and $5,000 to political action committees. You can see this is all pretty complex. and it's a tangled web as to who can give what to whom. Providing federal matching subsidies was the final provision of this law. Matching subsidies were provided to candidates for the party's nomination and election. The public funding program, which has financed every presidential election since 1976, consists of three parts: matching funds for presidential primary candidates who have met certain eligibility requirements, grants to sponsor political parties, presidential nominating conventions, and finally entitlements for the general election campaigns for major party nominees, and partial funding for qualified minor and new party candidates. Just as an aside here, I'd like to note that, that my statement there at the top of this saying that public funding program has financed every presidential election since 1976. There's some truth in that, in the sense that the money has been available to candidates since 1976, but recent presidential candidates have actually declined the federal money because of the strings attached to those monies. The FEC administers the public funding program. The commission determines which candidates and committees are eligible for public funds and in what amounts. The program is funded by the checkoff that appears on federal income tax forms. Originally, that was $1. Now it's $3, so that the amount available for public funding is not indexed to inflation. And I'm not sure whether most of you in this class will have filled out a federal income tax form, but if and when you do, or if you have, you will either check or not check the box that $3 will be designated for public funding. Note that your refund or your amount owed will not be affected by that $3. It's simply registering a preference for how much public funding should be provided to the FEC for public funding of campaigns. So how does the primary matching fund system work? Partial public funding is available to presidential primary candidates in the form of federal matching payments. Candidates that seek their party's nomination to the presidency can qualify to receive matching funds by raising over $5,000 in each of 20 states. In other words, they need to raise $100,000 to be eligible for matching funds. Primary election candidates seeking matching funds have to submit a letter of agreement and certification. This document is a contract with the government. In exchange for public funding, the candidates promise to comply with the provisions of the FECA and the Presidential Primary Matching Account Act. As part of this agreement, candidates pledge to limit national spending for all primary elections and to limit spending in each state based on its voting age population. Just as an aside, again here in 2000, George W. Bush chose not to accept public funding for the primary campaign, but all other candidates did accept public funding for the primary campaign. To see who spent what during past presidential primary seasons, we have an organization called OpenSecrets.org that goes to the FEC and compiles data on who spent what during presidential primary seasons. And so let's look at some historical data on this. First, let's look at 2012. Okay, we're going to go there. And you can see that in 2012, Barack Obama, the winner, raised $722 million. Mitt Romney raised $450 million. Barack Obama spent almost all of that. Mitt Romney spent all of that, almost all of that, and then they ended up with some debts. Actually, they ended up with no debt, and then they had cash on hand at the end of the campaign. Barack Obama had $3 million, and Mitt Romney had $383 million. And the total amount spent is shown for blue team and red team, blue being Democrat, red being Republican. You can see that in 2012, the red team spent slightly more than the blue team did. Okay, you can next on this page see where the contributions came from. You can see that Barack Obama received $234 million in small individual contributions and $315 million in large individual contributions. Barack Obama received zero from political action committees. He spent $5,000 of his own money, and note the zero here. That zero there. That zero shows that Barack Obama received nothing in the way of federal funds from the FECA. In other words, as George W. Bush had done in the 2000 election, Barack Obama declined to receive federal funds. And the reason he would have done that is because there were stipulations and requirements there. If we move to Mitt Romney, we'll see that Mitt Romney had substantially less in individual contributions, 80 million compared to 234 million for Barack Obama. That large individual contributions, Mitt Romney had 223 million, and Obama had actually more than that, more than Mitt Romney did. You can see 315 million to 223 million. Mitt Romney also declined federal funds with the zero that's gone there. For Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, you can see the top contributors for the candidates. Barack Obama, the University of California gave 1.35 million to Barack Obama. Microsoft gave 815,000. Google 804,000. The U.S. government 736,000, and Harvard University 680,000. You might ask, well, whoa, wait a minute. The University of California gave 1.35 million. Actually, it was employees of the University of California that gave 1.35 million. Same thing with the U.S. government here in this line. Federal employees gave $737 million to Barack Obama, or $736,000 to Barack Obama. Okay, so Obama's top contributors were University of California, Microsoft, Google, the U.S. government, and Harvard University. In contrast, Mitt Romney's main contributors were Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase, and Wells Fargo. Notice a difference here in sources of contributions. Barack Obama's were largely tech funds as well as university employees, whereas Mitt Romney's were largely from big financial interests. And that's kind of what we would expect in the difference between Democrats and Republicans. Segue forward to 2016 and go to the same source. Okay, so we can see that in 2016, Hillary Clinton spent $563,757,000, and in outside money, $206 million. In contrast, Donald Trump spent only $333,127,164 with outside money of $100 million. And so we could ask the question, does money make a difference in elections? You can see that in this case, Donald Trump spent significantly less than Hillary Clinton, and yet he won the presidency. Of course, he did not win the popular vote, but he did win the electoral vote. Okay, we can, this page is a little bit different than the earlier page was. We can click on Hillary Clinton, and we can go to fundraising details, and you can see that the PAC, the Political Action Committee, Hillary for America, and Priorities USA Action were by far the largest in terms of raising and spending money on behalf of Hillary Clinton. We can look at the source of the funds for Hillary. Large contributions, about 300 million. Small individual contributions, about 106 million. Candidate self-financing, looks like she spent 1.45 million on her own campaign. One thing to point out here is that Hillary spent zero in federal funds. In other words, she did not take advantage of public financing. Okay, so we can also look at the industries and the contributors. Well, let's go to industries for Hillary. You can see that for Hillary, you had securities and investment, you had retired people, lawyers and law firms, education, TV, movies and music, Democratic liberal organizations, and so forth for Hillary. And we will look at the contributors who contributed. You can see that you can actually see the groups and companies that contributed to Hillary Clinton's campaign. So let's back out of this and go to Donald Trump to get the same sort of information. And so let's click on Donald Trump. And the industries, well, let's look first at okay, you can see that Trump's contributions, 87 million was small individual contributions, 47 million were large contributions. Again, Trump, like Clinton, refused any federal monies. Okay, and then we can go to industries. And you can see that retired people were by far the largest contributors to Hillary Clinton. But like Mitt Romney in 2012, you see that securities and investment is a big source. Real estate is a big source of money. TVs, movie and music, and so forth were contributing to Donald Trump. And then we can go to contributors, and you can see what companies and groups contributed to Donald Trump. So I'll let you explore that on your own, and we will return back to our lecture page. So look at subsets on that page for each candidate by selecting the candidate's name for sectors and selected industry totals. Okay, so how general election funding works. The presidential nominee of each major party is eligible for a public grant of $20 million plus a cost of living adjustment for the general election campaign. Considering the cost of living change since 1976, certifications of $84.1 million were made by the FEC for the general election campaigns of Barack Obama versus John McCain. Note, this was the last year that a presidential candidate chose to receive public funds. And this is, of course, the 2008 election. So Obama and McCain chose to receive public funds in 2008. In 2012 and 2016, no candidate received public funds. So they opted out of public funds, likely because of the restrictions that were imposed on their spending. To be eligible for public funds, and this is still a possibility for candidates to receive public funds, to be eligible, candidates have to agree to limit their spending to the amount of the grant and must pledge not to accept private contributions for the campaign. Minor party candidates and new party candidates may qualify for partial general election funding based on their party's electoral performance. Note that these funds do not include money spent by political parties on behalf of the candidates and what we will subsequently term soft money. Okay, go to the following link at the FEC to get a complete description of the process. We won't go there. I'll leave it up to you to explore that FEC link further. Also, for more information on presidential election funding, you can go to the FEC to browse data. And here you'll find data on who contributed what to which candidates. And this breaks it down to the individual person's contributions. You can search on a person's name. For example, if I had contributed $25 to the Biden campaign, my name would be in that registry, and you could identify me as having contributed money to the Biden campaign. Or if you had contributed money to the upcoming Trump campaign, then your name would be in the FEC database. Okay, as promised a moment ago, soft money. Soft money is very important in presidential elections. What is soft money? Soft money is money raised and spent outside the limitations and prohibitions of federal election law. It is often consisted of large donations from individuals, corporations, and labor unions. These funds, which are usually given to state and national party committees, cannot legally be raised or spent to affect federal elections. So note, these monies are given typically to state and national party committees, but they can't legally be raised or spent to affect federal elections. Some critics of soft money have argued that soft money is being raised and spent in ways that may affect federal candidates, including those running for president. To fully understand the soft money problem, you have to examine how the money is raised and how it is spent. And so generally, these expenditures, while billed as get out the vote initiatives, have been spent on issue ads that do not directly advocate a particular candidate, but which imply one candidate over another. So soft money expenditures in the last several presidential elections have become virtually indistinguishable from other campaign expenditures. Just to elaborate just somewhat, if an ad were run on television or on the internet that one candidate, that we ought not to be funding abortion, and that that maybe your vote should depend on who is supportive and not supportive of abortion, then we haven't advocated one candidate over the other, but what we have done is implied one candidate over the other. And this is sort of the way soft money has worked in the past. And it's become virtually indistinguishable from other campaign expenditures, in that it's easy to imply voting for one candidate over the other in soft money ads. Okay, in recognizing this, the McCain-Feingold-Cochran Campaign Reform Bill of 2002 was passed. That law instituted a ban on soft money. The bill prohibited all soft money contributions to the national political parties from corporations, labor unions, and wealthy individuals. State parties are permitted under state law to accept those unregulated contributions, but they are prohibited from spending them on activities related to federal elections, including advertising that supports or opposes a federal candidate. In addition, federal candidates are prohibited from raising soft money. So essentially, these provisions of the McCain-Feingold-Cochran bill law shut down the Washington soft money machine, prohibiting the $100,000, $250,000, and even $500,000 contributions that for the prior decade had flowed into the political parties. McCain-Feingold-Cochran also doubled the amount of hard money that individuals could contribute to state parties for use in federal elections, from $5,000 to $10,000. It also increased the amount of hard money an individual may contribute in aggregate to all federal candidates, parties, and PACs in a single year from $25,000 to $30,000. So what is hard money? Hard money is money donated under the rules of the Federal Election Committee to candidates and to political parties. McCain-Feingold-Cochran also restricted phony issue ads, that is, ads run by corporations and labor unions. This was the Snow-Jeffords Amendment to the law. It was first adopted as part of McCain-Feingold during the Senate's February 1998 campaign finance debate, and it addressed the explosion of thinly veiled campaign advertising funded by corporate and union treasuries. These ads skirted federal election law by avoiding the use of direct entreaties to vote for or vote against a particular candidate. Under the bill, labor unions and for-profit corporations were prohibited from spending their treasury funds on electioneering communications. Foreign money. McCain-Feingold-Cochran also strengthened the law to prohibit foreign nationals from making any contributions in a federal, state, or local election. The foreign money abuses from the 1996 election that captured so much attention were entirely shut down by that aspect of the law. McCain-Feingold-Cochran also provided for greater disclosure and stronger election laws. It also contained a number of provisions designed to improve disclosure of campaign finance information and strengthen enforcement of the law. Where there's a will, there's a way. Rule 527 in the Internal Revenue Code provided for tax exemptions for advocacy groups organized to raise money for political activities. The 527s have been around for many, many years, but it was not until 2002, when the soft money loophole was closed, that the 527 organizations developed. The 527s are not officially involved with political parties, and also they're not subject to campaign finance restrictions because of their non-affiliation with political parties. Provided they don't directly endorse candidates, these groups are able to spend money during the campaign without violating federal campaign spending and contribution limits. Democrat-leaning groups formed some 527s very quickly in response to McCain-Feingold. Examples: the Media Fund, financed with millions and millions of dollars from billionaire George Soros. MoveOn.org. This is the organization that blasted George W. Bush for losing U.S. jobs to outsourcing to foreign countries. Republican-leaning 527 groups also formed. The most famous of these was the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. This group financed ads, indeed false ads, attacking Democrat John Kerry's service in Vietnam. Okay, McCain-Feingold-Cochran was subject to legal challenge. And the Supreme Court, in its decision, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, partially invalidated McCain-Feingold-Cochran. In Citizens United versus FEC, the court held that the First Amendment prohibits government from placing limits on independent spending for political purposes by corporations and unions. The 5-4 decision originated in a dispute over whether the nonprofit corporations Citizens United could air a film critical of Hillary Clinton, and whether the group could advertise the film in broadcast ads featuring Clinton's image, and this was in apparent violation of the 2002 Campaign Reform Act in reference to its primary Senate sponsors. The decision reached the court on appeal from a January 2008 decision by the DC Court of District of Columbia. The lower court decision had upheld provisions of the 2002 Act, which prevented the film Hillary the movie from being shown on television within 30 days of the 2008 Democratic primaries. But the Supreme Court reversed the lower court, striking down those provisions of McCain-Feingold that prohibited all corporations, both profit and not-for-profit and unions from broadcasting electioneering communications. An electioneering communication was defined in McCain-Feingold as a broadcast, cable, or satellite communication that mentioned a candidate within 60 days of a general election or 30 days of a primary. The court did uphold requirements for disclaimer and disclosure by sponsors of ads. The case did not involve the federal ban on direct contributions from corporations or unions to candidate campaigns or political parties, which remain illegal in races for federal office. And so what we have here is a partial overturning of the McCain-Feingold-Cochran legislation, and it maintained the disclosure requirements for sponsors of ads, but it did not involve a federal ban on direct contributions to candidate campaigns and political parties. Those remain illegal. So if the money is spent independently by corporations and for-profit or not-profit and unions, then it is legal. So soft money, to the extent that it is spent independent of the campaigns and the parties, then remains legal. Okay, just a little bit more here and we'll conclude. Getting the nomination requires time and energy devoted to the pre-primary and pre-convention period. This requires a strong, in-depth organization for both the initial primaries and caucuses. It requires a firm financial base. It requires a strategy, that is, understanding the rules of the game. Candidates should magnify victories and minimize their defeats. Groups within parties have to be targeted and appeals to them made. And so over the course of the campaign, these appeals have to be moderated, because you don't want to enter the election season by having alienated the extremes of your political party. If the overall constituency is too narrow, it is impossible to win the general election, because you need more than the left or the right to win a general election. You need those in the middle to win a general election. That's going to include your party's less extreme elements as well as independents to win a general election. The convention, as we talked about earlier, due to reforms in the pre-convention process, the nomination is typically sewed up long before the convention. Modern conventions do not, therefore, select the nominees, but they do serve other purposes. They are media events. They're highly visible, and they crystallize the party faithful. They serve as a starting point for the presidential campaigns. They enable the putting together of party platforms. For parties, the purpose is to show off the nominees, the policy positions, and so forth. At least formally, conventions make some judgments. They establish rules for the convention, and they accept or reject delegate credentials, and they also forge the party platforms and choose the standard bearers for the party. The coalition then decides on a platform, which may or may not be helpful during the campaign. For example, Bush in 1992, this is Bush the father, in 1992, had a problem with abortion because in 1992, Republicans, you may not know this, but Republicans were as much as Democrats in favor of legalized abortion. In fact, if you look at the data on this from my book recently, you'll see that Republicans only changed on the issue of abortion well into the 1990s. The reality of the Democratic convention for 2020, you can go to the hot link that I have here. We know that this is going to be a really unusual year, but the reality for the Democratic National Convention is summarized here at this Wikipedia link. It tells you where the convention is going to be, and it talks about some of the changes that have occurred as a result of the current situation. The reality of the Republican convention is given here. And the elections are about leadership style, personality, individuals, party loyalties, media diversion. They're about accountability for past and future actions, past actions for incumbents, future actions for non-incumbents. They're about resolving group conflict, an important stabilizing mechanism for the political system. They're about legitimizing the regime. They're about cycles of change. Politicians tend to be responsive to constituencies as elections approach. For presidents, this increased responsiveness and focus occurs 4 years into the presidency. Elections are all about establishing a national policy agenda. Who wins is determined by party ID. When party ID is weak or missing, other factors become important. Things like candidate image, personality, style, good looks, religion, advertising, experience in office, character issues such as trust, integrity, candor. However, these factors tend to be short-term influences of political behavior. The main thing is party ID. To be important, issues have to stand out from campaign rhetoric. They have to attract attention and to hit home. Elections may be determined by voter turnout. Turnout, in turn, is affected by voter registration laws. For example, Florida in 2000. The efforts of parties to get out the vote, demographics, weather patterns, all of these things are important in turnout. Campaign finance, the costs of a presidential campaign have spiraled since the 1960s. Money does not predict election outcomes, especially for incumbents. We saw that in 2016. Even a non-incumbent can win after spending less money on the campaign. News coverage and the press is important in election campaigns. Good press, bad press, both can affect election outcomes. And we will talk about this more significantly when we talk about the media in a subsequent session. Okay, you can see now that we have reached the conclusion of the prepared slides on presidential selection. This has been part 2 of our discussion of presidential selection processes. The focus of part 2 has been on reforms to the presidential selection process since 1970. And you can see that the process has been completely altered since 1970. In the early days, you had King Caucus, and the Congress selected presidential nominees. Subsequent to that, you had the state party elites who would select presidential candidates. And then after 1970, you see the rise of presidential primaries with the public, the mass public and the voting public as being important to presidential selection. Next time, we will talk about political parties and interest groups more specifically as they relate to the ongoing presidency. And so we will stop there and continue next time with that discussion. So let me stop the recording.